Many people claim the Bible has been changed. Is that true? In this video, I'm going to respond to the 4 most common arguments that you hear from people who claim the Bible's been changed, and I'm going to show you that none of them are good. Are you ready? Let's dive into it. Argument number 1. There's an Old Testament and there's a New Testament. Now, this argument is the worst of them all, and yet it's still used by many people today. It shows they have no idea what the Bible really is about. The New Testament is not a revision of the Old Testament. Instead, they're just 2 different sections of the Bible. The Old Testament contains the books that were written before Jesus came to this earth, and the New Testament are the books from Jesus' time onwards. And yet, both Old and New Testament are consistent with each other, and so, no, that is not a reason to say the Bible has been changed. Argument number 2. We don't have the original manuscripts of the Bible. Now, this is actually true. The original manuscripts have been lost. But did you know that we don't have the original manuscripts of any document from all antiquity? And regarding the Bible, it's not worrying at all that we don't have the originals. Why? Because we have thousands of copies of them. For example, if I happen to lose a letter that I received from a friend, but before I lost it, I already made 100 duplicate copies of it, just for safekeeping. So if I lost the letter, do I still know what the original letter said? Of course I do, because I have 100 copies of it. In fact, if I had the choice of either having the original letter or 100 copies of it, I'd actually prefer the 100 copies of it. Because what if, say, my brother got hold of the original letter and drew on it, or crossed out some of the words, or wrote over the top of it? I'd actually have much greater difficulty reconstructing the original wording. But not so if I had 100 copies of it. I would clearly know what the original said. And so if I had 100 copies, even if my brother got his hands on one of those copies and modified it slightly, all the other copies wouldn't have the change, and so I still know what the original letter said. And this is the case with the Bible. It's better that we actually have so many copies of the Bible compared to just having the original. And not only do we just have 100 copies, we actually have 5,800 copies of even just the New Testament in Greek alone, either partial fragments or complete manuscripts. And so from that, we can clearly determine what the original said. If someone was to change one of those copies, the remaining manuscripts wouldn't have that same change. And so that means the Bible is still unchanged for us today. In terms of the amount of manuscripts we have, if we were to include even the amount of manuscripts we have in other languages, it would actually total about 25,000 copies of the New Testament alone. And what's remarkable is that even if we didn't have any manuscript copies of the Bible, let's say they all got lost, we could actually still recreate the entire Bible purely from the quotations of the Bible from the early church fathers. And to make a quick contrast between the New Testament versus other documents from antiquity, Plato's works from about 380 BC, total amount of manuscripts we have of that, only about 200. And the earliest manuscript we have dates to the 9th century. That's over 1,000 years after the original. The New Testament then is the gold standard in terms of the amount of manuscripts we have for it, and it shows that the Bible has not been changed. Argument number 3. Extra verses in some manuscripts. It's true that some later manuscripts of the New Testament do have a small amount of extra words in them. But firstly, those extra words don't teach any different doctrine than the rest of the Bible. And secondly, we can go back to the earliest copies we have of the New Testament and see that those extra words are not there. And so therefore, helpfully, our modern translations haven't included them, such as Matthew 17:21. It's not there in the modern translations because it's not in the earliest copies we have of the New Testament. Or other times, modern translations will put the verses in brackets and make a note saying that they're not found in the earliest manuscripts, so the reader can understand that this section is not actually part of the Bible. For example, the longer ending of Mark, or the woman caught in adultery story in John chapter 8. But this too doesn't show that the Bible has been changed, because chapter numbers and verse numbers were not in the original Bible. They were added by someone in the 13th to 16th century to help with navigation and reference. So regarding Matthew 17:21, the person who put the chapter and verse numbers into the Bible simply added that verse number where there was actually no text in the earliest manuscripts. And since we still have the earliest manuscripts, we can go back to them to see what the Bible says, because those manuscripts don't change with time. And so helpfully our modern translations into English will go back to them. the earliest manuscripts, for their translations. What that means is that the KJV is not the original Bible. It's just a translation of the Bible from the 1600s. The KJV is not the standard. The Hebrew and Greek manuscripts are the standard. Argument number 4. There's many different English translations and they get updated. Now, English translations can and do get updated. Why? Because the English language changes over time. We don't speak in Shakespearean English these days. So thankfully, we can have our Bibles in modern English to help 21st century readers understand it well. But this is not the Bible being changed, because the Hebrew and Greek text hasn't changed. That remains the same. This is just English translations that may get updated for readability's sake, but it doesn't change the meaning at all. And having multiple different English translations is simply because you can translate the same words slightly differently in different ways and yet still have the same meaning. But we can always go back to the Hebrew and Greek to see what the original languages said, so nothing has been lost. And when you do that, you see how incredibly reliable our English translations are, particularly the literal ones. So next time someone says that the Bible's been changed, now you can respond by saying, wait up a second, that's not the case. God has preserved His word, not in a particular English translation, but in the Hebrew and Greek manuscripts, of which we have thousands, and they have been reliably translated into English and other languages so that people can read His precious word. Did you learn something? Pass this video on to your friends.